Hello everyone, I'm Wave, and today I wanted to talk about a visual novel that I finally finished reading, and a visual novel that I think a lot of people have already read, but despite the fact that a lot of people have already read it, I kind of wanted to give my thoughts on Fate/stay night. It's a visual novel that I ended up enjoying quite a bit, but this review might end up coming across as like a little bit of like a pretty nitpicky review, just because I feel like throughout my time reading, while I did enjoy it, I was really trying to kind of like dig deeper and try and like pinpoint all of the small stuff that kind of irked me a little bit and maybe lessened my experience throughout the past 2 months that I have been reading it. So hopefully I can put my thoughts into words in this review as to both the good and the bad that I experienced in my time in Fate/stay night. So let's get into it. So I do not think it would be an understatement to say that Fate/stay night is easily one of, if not the most popular visual novel across the entire medium. And so you might be wondering why it took me so long to actually read it. I want to say it was a couple years back. I don't know how many years, but I did end up reading the original Fate route, and then for whatever reason I just never got around to reading Unlimited Blade Works and Heaven's Feel. So for people that do not know how Fate/stay night works, the story of Fate/stay night is laid across 3 different routes within linear route progression. So the way that it's structured, you cannot play the 3 routes out of order. You have to play Fate route, followed by Unlimited Blade Works, followed by Heaven's Feel. This version that I ended up finishing is the Fate/stay night remaster available on Steam that we got, I want to say like a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago at this point. But let's not beat around the bush. Fate/stay night, while being very popular, is one of, if not the most pirated visual novels across the entire medium. And that has kind of shifted, obviously, as we have an official means to play the game now. But from the time that I read Fate route, however long ago, that was sectioned into 3 different game applications. So I could have technically played Unlimited Blade Works first and did the routes in whatever order. But talking about the actual remastered version that is readily available to people, I ended up enjoying how it was structured. For whatever reason, I ended up liking how it was all just lumped into one application. And one thing that I do remember from my time reading that older version of Fate/stay night is that for whatever reason, I ended up finding that the slice of life segments didn't really hit for me for some reason. And I don't know exactly why. And despite the fact that when I timed it too as well, I was able to shave off, I think 2 or 3 hours in how long it took me to finish reading Fate route from now compared to back in the day. So I was able to shave off a couple hours. And despite that, for some reason, something just kind of connected with me reading it the second time, to where I felt the slice of life moments kind of hit a little better. And I would say, as far as pacing wise, felt consistently better than, for whatever reason, the older version that I had played unofficially. But I do kind of want to quickly touch upon the fact that despite the fact that you're not going to actually see people really readily talking about Fate/stay night as far as piracy nowadays, comparing to something like Tsukihime, where I think people are pretty open about the fact that you can play that game on browser or something like that. From what I hear, there was a kind of definitive edition that was made by fans that allowed you to play either the original PC version with H scenes or the Rialta newer version, which is what the remastered version on Steam is based off of. I don't know. It's probably out there, and I mean, obviously it would be very hard to say, okay, well, how can the remastered version beat out a version that you could technically get for free, right? But at the same time, as far as the official version and what I ended up playing, I ended up enjoying it. It has a fair bit of upgrades, obviously, from the resolution and all the updated graphics, despite the fact that the sprites and the OST remain the same. Graphically, it looks quite good. And also, in addition to that, on the title screen, there is some extra stuff that they added as far as being able to go into the main menu, and then you can click, and as you play more and more of Fate/stay night, you'll unlock little lore pieces for okay, what is some details about the servants that you end up coming across, and the weapons and stuff like that, to where I feel one of the main reasons why Fate/stay night is so popular is because of how well fleshed out its lore is. to where as the story progresses, there is like a lot of little like segments. We could talk about it as far as pacing later, but throughout reading Fate Stay Night, you will have these moments like where the story will transition and you go into a interlude where you're able to dive into a little bit of a different perspective from the main character and see some sort of like outlook on some other character, or get some like additive information as to like the bigger, broader scope of the story within Fate Stay Night. I think is quite like fleshed out when it comes to lore and characters, and I feel like a lot of the characters do end up feeling quite fleshed out by the time you've read hours upon hours of Fate Stay Night, to where while a majority of the time you are seeing the story through the eyes of the main character, a lot of the other characters feel like they've had plenty of time to really like be built upon, and to where you can kind of appreciate them despite the fact that you're not actually playing through their perspective. Now getting into that kind of like interlude thing, some things I kind of wanted to talk about that I guess all kind of just like begin at that like kind of starting point of how the game will transition into interludes. I mentioned it in my review of the Tsukihime remake, and I kind of mentioned that for whatever reason in Tsukihime remake there was a lot of like black screen transitions that happen as you're like progressing between scenes, and it felt like it like if you're somebody that kind of fast reads throughout visual novels, it kind of like takes you out of your tempo for reading, if that makes sense, to where you can kind of just be like really chewing through story, and then all of a sudden you get a bait out from the scene that you're in, and then it takes a couple of seconds for like this black screen to go on to screen and then like transition into that next scene. And it feels kind of awkward the first few times it happens, and for whatever reason it still happened in Fate Stay Night Remastered, despite the fact that graphically it is less intensive, and I do not think it is actual performance. I played it on PC rather than playing it on like Switch, and despite the fact that, you know, it's a visual novel and it shouldn't really be taxing, right? I was kind of curious as to like, wait, why am I getting these black screens? And I think genuinely it is a sort of like way that they added into both Tsukihime remake and the Fate Stay Night Remaster to kind of like slow down the pacing and make it to where you're gonna feel a little bit like more immersed, I want to say. One thing as far as Fate Stay Night when it comes to like the actual text on screen is that there are two different like forms of visual novel, like I don't know whatever you want to describe it as, to where a lot of visual novels nowadays are within the ADV format, which is where the text is only in like in a little text box on the bottom of the screen. Fate Stay Night is the other format, being NVL, to where a lot of the text is going to be across the full screen, and you'll have all of the images and the visuals, whatever, towards the back that is like slightly obscured by that text. It doesn't really ever like stop you from enjoying the visuals, but I noticed what kind of like goes along with that whole thing of that I said, like black screen transitions and trying to like immerse the reader, is that Fate Stay Night, compared to maybe another visual novel that I could use as an example that I think uses NVL format like to its benefit, Fate Stay Night kind of has to like fight against NVL format at times, to where sometimes while you're reading you'll have a moment to where the text will show up on screen for like a fraction of a second, and then it will fade out the text, and like the first few times that happens you think you might have like accidentally skipped the text, but it's actually fading out the text so that way it can show you the full imagery underneath the text for like a brief second, so that way they could show whatever like little animation or whatever, right? And then it'll fade that text back in. And I think that was like one little detail that I think kind of irked me a little bit. It was like even like 30 something hours deep, I could still have moments where I like my heart skips a beat for a second because I'm like, oh, did I accidentally skip that text? But then no, it was just because of the way they kind of try to do that like immersion, but how they're kind of like fighting against their own system of how they made the game, is that they have to get rid of the text from using NBL format in order to show the reader one little thing that they really wanted to highlight. But getting back into that, like interludes, when it comes to interludes, I think it does a good job at like really highlighting maybe one character or one aspect of the story or the lore within Fate Stay Night. But at other times, I think it really slowed down the pacing. One thing I kind of wanted to touch upon is that within Fate Stay Night, the way that the story progresses is that it is within that like old school VN system of having like a day and night cycle, I guess, if you could say. And in contrast to maybe a lot of older visual novels that use that sort of like calendar day system, is that Fate's Day Night, by the end that you get to any dedicated day, you're asked if you want to save your game. And I think when it was kind of like when I got to Heaven's Feel, which is the third and final route, I had noticed that Heaven's Feel feels almost like it's twice as long as the route to come before it, and I don't necessarily think it does, but for whatever reason the pacing felt a lot slower. Maybe it was because there was less fight scenes and there was a lot more of like trying to be this sort of mystery novel that kind of shifts away from what you might have already been like used to experiencing in the other two routes that you read previously. Heaven's Feel kind of felt slower, and as I was reading Heaven's Feel for the past 2 weeks or something, I was really trying to kind of like dive in and decide what was it about Heaven's Feel that made me feel like it was like significantly slower paced. And I think in a way it kind of all comes back to that like interlude system, to where some of the interludes for like some characters or whatever felt like it was not really needed. I think a lot of people will say that yeah, they really like how heavy Fate goes in on the lore, but sometimes I felt like it was just drawing me out of the experience, where I was like, it's pulling me out of this like really intense scene or something and putting me into this like other like 5 minutes or whatever of some story that I like maybe don't even really remember, or like I don't know, it's like something that I kind of didn't really care about, to where I almost feel like there was too many interludes specifically in the last route of Fate's Day Night. And one thing that I was kind of trying to consider too is I don't really want to go too deep into it, because I know it's a pretty like nuanced topic to talk about, but a lot of people will maybe have the argument of, is it better to read the original source material, being the VN, or is it better to just watch the anime adaptation of Fate's Day Night? And it's up to personal preference. I think you could literally read or watch in whatever order you want, and you could still get a solid amount of enjoyment out of Fate's Day Night as a story. But one thing that I was kind of considering is that maybe the anime cuts a lot of the fat, because of the fact that like I specifically counted one singular calendar day on Heaven's Feel. It was the only instance of it, but it was like over 2 hours long, and I was like, okay, there's a lot of maybe not bloat, but like a lot of stuff that almost felt like it was just like too much. And I was kind of wondering too why the anime adaptation maybe feels so good is because of the fact that within Fate's Day Night, how I kind of mentioned earlier within some of the interludes, because throughout like the main story, you're actually playing as the main character and you are seeing it through his eyes. But some of the interludes, you almost feel like an observer instead, to where you're not actually playing as this other character through their perspective. Like you're zoomed out and are able to observe all of the bigger, broader points. And maybe that's why it works really well within an anime adaptation, because of the fact that they don't have to try and like push it as like, oh no, you are only in this character's like perspective, and you can kind of be in that observer role. So that was something I also kind of wanted to mention, because I was like, I feel like interludes were kind of hit or miss for me at times, because it's like sometimes it was like, okay, well, I feel like I appreciated the extra info that they provided, but sometimes I felt like it was padding out a little bit too much, and in a way kind of made me think about, okay, well, yeah, I think some of them I would have maybe appreciated if they kind of changed it up to where instead of maybe being an observer looking at a different character and getting their backstory, maybe if it was me getting their backstory through their eyes, like physically, then I would kind of relate to them a little bit more and care maybe a little bit more. And I know the past couple minutes I've probably been really digging into Fate's Day Night. Last little like negative I want to talk about when it comes to Fate's Day Night is that within the story, I only really felt it kind of towards the latter end of Fate route being the first route in Fate's Day Night. But it kind of stuck with me and like made me kind of look at the broader story as a whole, to where I almost feel like there's like a bit of clichéness to some of the story beats within Fate's Day Night, to where a lot of the times within like fight scenes, you might have it to where the main cast are like about to be defeated and the main character is about to be killed or something. And then all of a sudden there'll just be this sort of like convenient plot point that's like, oh, well, time is up. So I'm the bad guy, but you know what? I will go ahead and I will leave you alive. Do not come back. And then they'll leave, and then the main cast will be allowed to live when they were about to die. like within the next couple of seconds, but for some reason something comes up and I don't know, it felt a little weird. I don't think it was something that really affected too much of the fight scenes or a lot of the plot throughout Fate's Day Night, but it was something I still kind of wanted to like dive into and kind of like note down, because I was like, okay, well, Fate's Day Night is really popular and I feel like a lot of people talk quite positively about it, but I kind of wanted to note down some of the like the negatives I experienced. And that was one thing that I was like, okay, well, the story is quite good, but there is some moments where it's like, okay, it's a little too plot convenient. Hopefully that's like the last negative I could talk about when it comes to Fate's Day Night. Obviously I would not have like gone through the effort of playing Fate's Day Night over the course of the past 2 months and finally like finish it to completion if I wasn't enjoying my time within Fate's Day Night. I like it. I think there is a good balance between both the fight scenes and the slice of life, and being able to like really bring out the characters and the story and make it feel like it is quite more like fleshed out. At times maybe it felt a little too fleshed out, but it doesn't really matter. Fate's Day Night is a very popular visual novel for many reasons, and I did enjoy my time reading it. I think it is a fun enough visual novel to read, but at the same time it is quite long. So if you are somebody that has not read it, you probably got to set aside quite some time to read it. For me, it was like almost 40 hours on the dot, I want to say, actually. It was like a little bit over 40 hours. So it took me 2 months, and I could have probably like condensed that down to be significantly less. But I was quite busy in January. So it took me 2 months to read through Fate's Day Night, and I did end up enjoying my time with it. I kind of wanted to just talk about both the positives and the negatives. And while this review probably sounds a little bit too much on the negative side, I do want to just reiterate that I did end up enjoying my time with Fate's Day Night Remastered. And if for some reason you have not read it at this point, if you are a fan of, I guess, hybrid between both slice of life and more of a like that action oriented storytelling, Fate's Day Night is something that should probably be on your radar. So yeah, those have been my thoughts on Fate's Day Night. Thank you guys for watching. I've been Wave, and I will see you next time.